For 40 years, I sat in the shadows of the Supreme Court, transcribing the sins of criminals. I was the invisible observer. But when I returned home today, my key wouldn't turn. The door opened to my brother's new wife, Robin, wearing his gold pendant and a predatory smile. She told me my brother was in a coma and she was my new conservator. "I'll be managing your insulin from now on," she hissed. She thinks I'm a helpless old woman, but she forgot one thing: I'm still recording. Listen to the end to hear how I handled it, and subscribe to hear more of my journey. The brass key bit into the lock and stopped dead. I stood on my own front porch, pharmacy bag in hand, and felt the cylinder refuse me. Not a stiff tumble, not the slight resistance of a lock that needed WD-40, a complete, cold rejection. I pulled the key out, examined it under the gray afternoon light filtering through the Douglas firs, and reinserted it with the deliberate care I'd learned from 40 years of precision work. Nothing. The tumblers were gone. The lock had been changed. Through the frosted sidelight panel beside the door, a shadow moved. Not Arthur's. I knew my brother's shuffle, the particular drag of his left foot since his hip replacement, the way he led with his shoulder. This movement was fluid. Unhurried. The shadow moved the way water moves before a riptide, smooth on the surface, with enormous force underneath. I set the pharmacy bag down at my feet. The deadbolt retracted from inside with a sharp, mechanical clack that reverberated through the mahogany grain I'd polished just yesterday morning with lemon oil. That sound, precise, deliberate, final, registered in the part of my brain that spent 4 decades converting sound into record. It was the sound of a gavel. Not a greeting. A ruling. The door didn't swing open. It was wrenched back, exposing my foyer, my grandmother's wool runner, my row of coat hooks, my handwritten labels on the key tray, like evidence being presented to a hostile court. She filled the frame. Robin. 42 years old, 5'7", and built with the coiled economy of an athlete who has never needed to hurry because she always arrived first. She wore a silk robe the color of cream, my sister-in-law's robe, dead 3 years, still folded in the cedar chest as of 2 weeks ago, and around her neck hung Arthur's heavy 24-karat gold pendant. The one my brother wore to his wife's funeral. The one he told me once, in that quiet, embarrassed way men admit their sentimentalities, that he'd wear until they put him in the ground. Her honey-brown eyes crinkled at the corners. The smile extended all the way to her cheekbones and then stopped there, as if it had encountered an invisible wall and could go no further. "Judith, dear," she said. The voice was a practiced, melodic purr, the kind that takes years to calibrate, warm enough to pass the first inspection, hollow enough to raise the hairs on your forearms if you're listening correctly. "You're late. I was beginning to think you'd wandered off." She didn't step back. She occupied the threshold with the comfortable propriety of someone who had already mentally redecorated the interior. Her hip rested against the door frame. She was not letting me in, she was deciding whether to. I held her gaze, those predatory honey-brown eyes, and kept my face precisely neutral. 40 years in the state Supreme Court had given me a poker face that judges had complimented. I used it now. "Excuse me," I said. 2 words. Flat. Documentary. She stepped aside by exactly 4 inches, enough to force me to turn sideways to enter my own home. "Arthur had a stroke." She said it quietly, her lips almost at my ear as I cleared the threshold, the floral weight of her perfume closing around me like a hand. Not the Earl Grey and old paper smell of my house, her perfume, thick and aggressive, that had already colonized the foyer. "An hour after you left for the pharmacy," she continued, her voice dropping to a murmur with the calibrated intimacy of someone delivering a verdict. "He's in a coma at St. Jude's. The doctors say he's stable, but the paperwork is already filed." She paused to let that word, paperwork, land. "I'm the emergency conservator for the estate." The words arrived with the clinical coldness of a deposition I'd once transcribed, the the decedent's affairs were immediately assumed by the petitioner. I had typed those words hundreds of times. I had never, until this moment, heard them spoken at me. She reached out, her long, manicured nails, acrylics, I noted, with the precision of a woman who records details, and plucked the pharmacy bag from my fingers. My own fingers, gone numb, let it go. Don't be difficult, she added softly, and the phrase landed like a footnote, something she'd said many times before, in many other houses, to many other women whose names she barely remembered afterward. I said nothing. My fingers began to move at my side, a habit so old it operated without my permission, the ghost rhythm of the steno keys, translating the moment into record. CONSERVATOR/ESTATE/ARTHUR/STROKE. I let the pattern ground me, the way I'd always let it ground me when the testimony got ugly. Her hand caught my shoulder. The grip was not violent, it was worse than violent. It was proprietary, the grip of someone who has already decided that your body is a detail in their logistical problem. She turned me, with the firm pivot of someone rearranging furniture, toward the narrow hallway leading to the guest suite at the back of the house. I've taken the liberty of moving your essentials, she said, her strut setting the pace, her hips finding their rhythm in my corridor. The hallway I had walked for 15 years was nearly impassable. Cardboard boxes, hastily taped, were stacked 3 high along the wainscoting. I recognized my own handwriting on some of them, labels from my filing system, repurposed, the originals crossed out in Robin's heavy black marker and replaced with single words, books. Miscellaneous, old stuff. 40 years of professional archives. My mother's photograph albums. The shorthand journals I'd kept since 1987, leather-bound and numerically sequenced on my study shelves. Packed. While I was at the pharmacy. While I was buying aspirin and a refill for my glucose test strips. The smell of her perfume pressed against the back of my throat. I breathed through my mouth and kept walking. In the kitchen, my kitchen, with its granite counters I'd chosen and its window overlooking the garden I'd planned, she dropped the pharmacy bag onto the island like a receipt she didn't need. She pulled the refrigerated box of Humalog from inside and held the glass vials up to the overhead light, tilting them, watching the clear liquid shift. Her expression was the expression of someone appraising jewelry at an estate sale. Interested. Calculating. Type 1 is such a delicate balance, isn't it? She set the box down and walked to the pantry, her silk robe whispering against the tile. She retrieved something I had never seen before, a small, steel lockbox, gunmetal gray, with a combination dial. She placed my insulin inside it. She turned the dial. She dropped the key into the pocket of the robe. I'll be personally managing your dosages from now on, she said, closing the pantry door. We can't have you forgetting a shot and causing a scene. The smile returned, all teeth, no warmth. Safety first. The rage that moved through me was a slow thing. Not hot, not blinding. Cold. The kind of cold that doesn't dissipate but concentrates, like water hardening into ice. I had transcribed the testimonies of men who had held entire communities hostage through the control of a single resource: water rights, medication supply, access to the courts. I had typed those words with the composure of an impartial observer. I was not impartial now. But I held still. The ice stayed where I put it. I moved to the wall-mounted kitchen phone, the landline I'd kept specifically for emergencies, the number programmed to ring directly to St. Jude's nurse's station, to Arthur's doctor, to the 3 people who needed to know if something happened to me. My fingers closed on empty air. The mounting bracket was there. The beige plastic housing was there. But the cord was gone, severed above the base plate with a clean, surgical cut. A single snip, no fraying, no drama. Someone had done this with a good pair of scissors and a clear sense of purpose. Robin watched me from across the counter, her elbow on the granite, her chin in her hand. The shark smile. Patient. She was watching me discover the parameters of my cage. "Cell service is so spotty in these hills," she said. "I figured we'd save on the landline bill." She tilted her head toward the floor near the refrigerator. "Besides, you really should be more careful where you step." My smartphone lay in a scatter of black glass and aluminum on the tile. The screen wasn't cracked, it was obliterated, ground in. She'd stepped on it with intent. I looked at the pieces. I did not look at Robin. "For the record," I said quietly, and said nothing more. She picked up the fork from the plate I'd set out for my own lunch before I left: poached salmon, wilted spinach with lemon, 2 hours ago when the house was still mine. She ate from my plate the way a person eats when they want you to understand something about ownership. Slowly. Deliberately. Letting each bite make its point. "I've already spoken to the neighbors," she said, chewing. "Told them you've been having episodes." Confused. A little aggressive. She gestured with the fork as if painting a picture. "Classic early onset dementia, tragic in a woman your age, really. People love a tragic narrative. They'll expect you to be erratic now. Unreliable." She set the fork down and met my eyes. "If you try to flag someone down from the front yard, they'll just call me." She spoke about the demolition of my credibility with the same flat efficiency I'd once used to transcribe a routine traffic hearing: no malice in the delivery, because malice requires you to care about the target. Robin didn't care about me. I was a procedural obstacle. I stood at the kitchen counter with my hands folded in front of me and felt the full architecture of what she had built. The conservatorship. The insulin. The phone. The neighbors preloaded with her narrative. The sheriff, there would be a sheriff, there was always a sheriff, on her payroll. She had done this before. Multiple times, in multiple houses, with multiple women whose names she probably kept in a list somewhere, not from sentiment but from professional habit. She had forgotten one thing. She had left me in the room. I walked to my study. The mahogany desk was bare. I stood in the doorway and looked at the empty surface the way a surgeon might look at a missing instrument, with the cold, functional recognition that the problem was now significantly more complex. My steno machine, the professional Stentra 8000 LX I'd used for the final decade of my career, was gone. Not moved to the side, not set on the floor. Gone. The desk lamp still stood. The leather blotter still lay flat. The empty space where the machine had lived for 15 years was a wound with clean edges. Robin materialized in the doorway behind me. I heard her robe before I heard her footsteps. That noisy little typewriter? She picked a flake of salmon from between her teeth with one manicured fingernail. "It's in the garage. This is a house of healing now, Judith." Her voice softened to the register of synthetic compassion. "No more clicking. The silence will do you good." I turned from the desk and faced her. I looked at her for 3 full seconds with the unblinking, recording gaze that had unnerved defense attorneys for 4 decades. I did not let her see the thing that was happening behind my eyes. "Thank you," I said. Even. Deliberate. Precise. Something flickered in her honey-brown eyes. Not doubt, not yet, but the first microscopic hesitation of a predator who has encountered a prey animal that did not flinch. She covered it with the shark smile and walked away. Through the guest room window, the sheer curtain hanging in my hand, I watched a sheriff's cruiser roll into the circular driveway. White car, dust-streaked gold star on the door. The driver climbed out without urgency, a man with a soft gut and the slow, self-satisfied movements of someone who hasn't needed to hurry in a long time. He hitched his belt. He looked toward the house. Robin stepped onto the front porch in her silk robe, and the look that passed between them was not the look of a concerned neighbor checking in on a distressed resident. It was the look of colleagues confirming a shared understanding. He gave her a small nod. She tilted her head toward the interior of the house, meaning me. He nodded again. He didn't ring the bell. She let him in. I let the curtain fall. I stood with my spine precisely vertical. The posture was not performance. It was structural, bone deep, a physical habit of 40 years that held me together when everything else became turbulent. My fingers found their rhythm against my thigh, a silent code tapped into the fabric of my slacks. SJFFMILLR. I didn't know his name yet, but I would. COLLUSON. I watched his approach through the gap in the curtain, that specific slouch, the way his eyes skipped past the security camera mounted above the garage, the way a man moves when he has made certain that certain cameras are not recording. He had been bought. Not recently. The ease with which he wore the arrangement told me he'd been wearing it for some time, that Robin had cultivated this asset before she ever married my brother. She was thorough, I'd give her that. She'd laid her groundwork with the patience of someone who understood that the final act required infrastructure. I noted it. I filed it. I moved on. They saw a 65-year-old woman with failing blood sugar and no phone. They saw the fragile, the forgettable, the already diagnosed. A tragic narrative, Robin had said, and she believed it, because people always believe the narrative they've authored. She'd written me as the confused elderly relative, and she'd cast the neighbors and the sheriff to confirm the performance. She had made the classic error of the overconfident architect. She had forgotten about the occupant. In the state Supreme Court, the court reporter is the only person in the room who hears everything. The attorneys hear what they're listening for. The judge hears what the law requires. The jury hears what they're afraid to miss. But the stenographer hears the gaps, the hesitation before a name is given, the shift in breathing that precedes a lie, the half-second where a witness decides which version of the truth to deliver. I had been hearing those gaps for 40 years. Robin had staged a prison. She had forgotten that the most dangerous prisoner is the one who already knows the entire procedural code. I let the invisibility settle over me like a second skin. I leaned into it. A ghost. A recorder. An impartial observer. Good. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and reached into the deep pocket of my cardigan. It was still there. The backup digital glucose meter, a secondary unit I kept in my bag for travel, smaller than the primary, the one Robin hadn't thought to inventory when she was taking stock of my pharmaceutical vulnerabilities. Her mistake, not mine. I cupped it in both hands and worked the seam of the battery compartment with my thumbnail, the way I'd opened 100 jammed brackets over the years. It released cleanly. I spilled the 2 AAA cells into my palm and set them on the bedspread beside me. The compartment was just wide enough. Just deep enough. I tore a thin strip from the corner of the notepad on the bedside table. She'd left it there, probably hadn't noticed it was there, which told me something about her attention to detail that I filed away. The paper was thin but workable. I smoothed it against my knee. My hand was steady. This, of all things, did not waver. I had written under pressure in courtrooms where the testimony was so grotesque that the attorneys themselves had to look away. I had transcribed confessions that made the gallery go silent. The hand learned steadiness the way the spine learned posture, through repetition, through the daily practice of being the one element in a chaotic room that could not afford to shake. I wrote the first entry in a shorthand so compact, so personally encrypted with the idiosyncrasies of 4 decades of professional adaptation, that no one alive could read it without me standing in the room interpreting it. A master key I kept entirely inside my own skull. Day 1. 1432 hours S. Lane, alias Robin. Conservatorship. Insulin under lock. Phone lines severed. Sheriff Miller, asset, prior arrangement. Gold pendant, his. I rolled the strip carefully, slid it into the battery compartment, replaced the cells, and snapped the cover shut. The glucose meter went back into my cardigan pocket. I folded my hands in my lap and sat for a moment in the silence of my guest room, my house, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway mark the time, listening to the low murmur of Robin's voice from the kitchen, listening to the creak of the sheriff's weight on my floorboards. For the record, I thought, and the dry, brief chuckle that was the most I ever gave anyone moved through me and was gone. The trial of Sarah Lane had just been called to order. I slumped my shoulders and shuffled into the dining room. It was a deliberate performance, calibrated to a single purpose: convince the audience. I had spent 4 decades in courtrooms studying the theater of deception, witnesses who tried too hard to appear calm, defendants who rehearsed their grief until it had the cadence of a script. I knew how truth looked in a body. More importantly, I knew how damage looked. I let my body tell Robin's preferred story. I dragged my feet across the Persian rug I'd ordered from a catalog in 2009, the one I vacuumed every Saturday in overlapping rows because I found disorder in the fiber pattern genuinely distressing. Now I shuffled across it like a woman who no longer remembered it existed. My hands settled on the lace tablecloth, limp, open, useless. I arranged my face into the drifting vacancy of a person whose inner life had gone quiet. The dining room table was buried under paper. Bank statements, probate forms, the dense bureaucratic architecture of a legal seizure. The chandelier, crystal, 6 bulbs, another deliberate choice from another deliberate catalog, threw hard light across all of it, making the documents look official and inevitable and overwhelming in the way that Robin intended them to look. She had staged this room the way a prosecutor stages a courtroom. Evidence everywhere. Nowhere to rest the eye. I sat where she pointed and gave her nothing. A closed window. A system in sleep mode. Let her believe it. The trust fund passwords, Judith. Robin set her elbows on the table and dropped the melodic register from her voice. What remained was the instrument underneath, flat, functional, accustomed to compliance. Let's not make this a chore. She held a single syringe of Humalog between 2 fingers, the needle vertical, catching the chandelier light. Not offering it. Displaying it. The way a jeweler displays something you can't afford, with the understanding that desire is a form of leverage. I watched the needle. I could not entirely prevent watching the needle. That was not theater, that was my body's own mutiny, the biological urgency of a system that knew what it needed. My blood sugar had been climbing since the afternoon, since she'd locked the vials in that steel box. I could feel the shift, the particular, ugly fog of hyperglycemia settling over my thoughts like gauze, slowing the signal between what I observed and what I processed. If you want the medicine, she said, moving the syringe a precise half-inch further from my reach, I need the administrative access codes. Now. The trade was efficient. She'd reduced my 40-year professional legacy, my brother's financial security, and my own continued consciousness to a single transactional exchange, and she'd done it the way a competent grifter does, by removing all the emotionally resonant framing until only the raw mechanics remained. Give me this. Get that. Don't complicate it. I let my eyes drift slightly off her face, toward the window, toward nothing. I let my hands tremble on the tablecloth. I said nothing. The headache arrived with the methodical cruelty of a thing that has been building for hours and has decided, finally, that it has waited long enough. It took root behind my eyes, the specific, throbbing signature of blood sugar climbing past the range where my body could compensate. I knew this feeling the way old mariners know a particular quality of wind. 40 years of managing Type 1 had given me an interior weather system, and this was the barometric warning before something structural gave way. My vision began to blur at the periphery. The edges of the room softened, the chandelier's 6 bulbs acquiring halos. The silverware in front of me caught the light and seemed to multiply. I reached for the water glass, genuinely reached for it, because my mouth had gone ash dry, and my fingers fumbled the grip. The crystal stuttered against the tablecloth. Robin turned to the sheriff with the expression of a woman presenting a case she'd already won. "See, Miller." Her voice carried the affected sadness of someone performing concern for an audience of one. She can barely hold her head up. It's exactly like I told you. She gestured toward me with an open hand, a curator gesturing at an exhibit. She's losing her grip on reality. I let my chin drop a half-inch. I let my eyelids feel heavy. And I listened. The sheriff's boots were heavy on my hardwood floors, a specific, particular affront that I noted and filed. He moved to the sideboard where Robin had positioned a document, a statement of incapacity, pre-printed, with blanks for a witness signature. He didn't read it. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's already agreed to before being shown. Then he reached into his breast pocket for a pen. I tried to reach for the water glass again. My fingers slipped visibly. Robin moved with the fluid, choreographed grace of a woman who had rehearsed this moment. She appeared at my elbow, her hand closing over mine against the crystal, guiding it to my lips. Her grip was crushing, not enough to leave a mark, precisely enough to communicate the reality of the arrangement. There, she cooed, her voice pitched for the sheriff's ears, warm and solicitous and utterly synthetic. He scrawled his signature across the bottom of the document. He did not look up. I drank the water. I kept my eyes unfocused and let her hold my hand against the glass. Witness, Miller. Signature, obtained. Date, noted. Time, noted. In the shorthand inside my skull, the record grew. Night settled over the house. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked 8 o'clock, then 8:30, the chime swallowed by the thick quiet of the Pacific Northwest dark. Outside, the Douglas firs absorbed the last of the gray light and became shapes, then shadows, then just the suggestion of weight against the sky. Robin retreated to the master suite, my brother's room, his things, his space, with the unhurried propriety of someone who has already completed the paperwork on an inheritance. She left the door ajar. Whether by carelessness or as a message, I couldn't be certain, so I filed both possibilities and acted on neither until I had more data. From the shadow of the hallway, I watched. She moved through her nightly ritual with the particular, undisguised intimacy of someone who has forgotten, or never registered, that she can be observed. She opened the drawer of my brother's nightstand and pushed aside his reading glasses. She uncapped a serum and applied it to her throat with upward strokes. She examined her face in the vanity mirror with the cool, appraising expression of someone who has learned to treat their own appearance as an asset to be maintained. Then she reached behind her neck and unclasped Arthur's gold pendant. She set it on the vanity. Not carefully, carelessly, the way you set down something you know you'll pick up again, something that has value only as an instrument. It landed on the marble surface next to a row of expensive serums, the chain pooling around the heavy disc. She disappeared into the ensuite. The shower started with a hiss, the pipes in the walls clenching and releasing, and the sound filled the suite and spilled into the hallway, and I began to move. In my cardigan pocket, between my fingers, was the microtransmitter. I had found it that afternoon in the small, zippered compartment of my travel bag, the bag Robin had missed when she inventoried my belongings, because she'd been looking for pharmaceuticals and electronics, not audiological equipment. The transmitter was a component of my high-gain emergency hearing aid, a device I'd purchased 3 years ago after Arthur had started speaking more quietly. I had taken it apart by touch, in the dark, while Robin's voice traveled through the wall from the kitchen, and I had worked with the muscle memory of 40 years of technical maintenance on precision machinery. My fingers, though stiff at the joints, the cold did that, had been doing that for a decade, moved with the accuracy of long practice. A slim silver nail file from the vanity in the guest bathroom, borrowed and returned without event. I used the thin edge to find the seam in the pendant's hollow backing, gold, but not solid, an oversized decorative piece, not an heirloom of substance, and worked it open with incremental pressure until there was a gap just wide enough. The transmitter went in. I pressed it against the inner surface and applied the adhesive, a small bead from the tube of professional-grade bonding compound I used to repair the leather trim on my steno case. It would hold at room temperature indefinitely. I closed the backing. I set the pendant on the vanity. 2.4 inches from the edge. I had measured the distance with my thumb joint before I touched it. I returned it to the same position. I was back in the hallway's shadow before the shower spray ceased. The clink of the chain. I heard it from the hallway, the small, clean sound of gold settled against skin. A moment later, Robin emerged from the ensuite, the pendant resting against her collarbone, her dark mahogany hair damp and loose around her shoulders. She walked past the doorway without glancing toward the corridor. She didn't know. She was carrying a microphone pressed against her own heartbeat, a witness she had placed against herself, and she was moving through the house with the easy arrogance of a woman who had already won. The pendant she wore to mock my brother's helplessness, to display her dominion over his possessions, was now the instrument of her accounting. I returned to the guest room with measured steps and closed the door without sound. The receiver was under the mattress, inside a folded pillowcase, inside a fabric bag I'd tucked against the bed frame. Small, battery-operated, the partner unit to the transmitter. I'd acquired both 3 years ago for a purpose I never anticipated needing, and I had packed them in my travel bag out of the specific, habitual caution of a woman who spent her career in rooms where information was the only currency that mattered. I pressed the earpiece into my right ear. Static, then the static clarifying, the acoustics of the master suite, the ambient sound of a room, Robin's breathing. Then a phone rang. The burner phone. She answered on the second ring. "It's me," she said. The voice was different now, the melodic register stripped entirely, the warmth gone, the voice of a woman speaking to a colleague about a project that was proceeding on schedule. I recognized the register. It was the voice of someone being witnessed by no one. I sat on the edge of the mattress. My spine found its line, vertebra by vertebra, the professional posture reasserting itself without my conscious instruction. I was back in the court. The testimony was about to begin. The sheriff signed off. Robin's voice crackled through the transmitter with the crisp clarity of proximity. She was pacing, which meant the pendant was moving, which meant the transmission varied slightly in quality, but not in content. I heard everything. We liquidate the Pacific Northwest accounts by Friday. I reached for the steno paper. My hand was already moving. As for Arthur. A pause. The doctors say he's a vegetable. Another pause, not hesitation, but the beat of someone organizing a list. Once the deed is transferred, we'll sign the DNR and pull the plug. Clean and legal. Her voice didn't change registers when she said it. No lowering to a whisper, no pause to register the weight of what she was describing. My brother's life, my brother's extinguishment, delivered in the same tone one uses to discuss a property closing. Judith won't be far behind. A diabetic accident in a house full of stairs. Very sad. She was already showing signs. Routing numbers. Account numbers. The name of a bank in the Caymans. A second name, the realtor's real name, distinct from whatever alias she'd been using. She rattled them off in sequence, and her accomplice repeated them back, and she confirmed each one. My heart was hammering against my ribs with a force I felt in my temples, in my fingertips, behind my eyes where the hyperglycemia headache still throbbed. But the hammering stayed inside, contained, below the surface where it couldn't reach the hands. The hands were working. I didn't have my machine. My machine was in the garage, where Robin had put it to take the language out of me. She had understood, at least partially, at least professionally, that the steno machine was the tool I was most attached to, and so she had removed it. What she had not understood was that the tool is not the skill. The skill was 40 years old and lived in the hands, not in the machinery. I tore 2-inch strips from the steno paper supply I'd retrieved from under the mattress, where I'd hidden it in the afternoon while Robin was occupied with the sheriff. Professional-grade paper, the narrow format designed for court use, the same paper I'd used since 1983. The ballpoint pen was the one from the guest room notepad, an ordinary hotel-quality pen, not my preferred instrument, but workable. I braced the strip against my knee and wrote. Pittman shorthand. Not Greg, which most people associate with secretarial work. Pittman, the older system, the one I'd learned from my first supervisor at the Albany courthouse, the one I'd drilled until I could sustain 225 words per minute under cross-examination conditions. The strokes are geometrically precise, the dots and thicks and thins a visual code that compresses language the way a photograph compresses a scene. Dense. Accurate. Entirely unreadable to anyone who hadn't spent years inside the system. My hand moved across the strips as Robin spoke. Every account number. Every routing code. The Cayman Bank. The realtor's name. The DNR plan. The stairs. The diabetic accident. All of it, translated from air into permanent record in strokes so small and precise that a single strip held a complete paragraph. My brother's life. Reduced to a paragraph in the testimony of the woman who was planning to end it. I kept writing. When the call ended, I worked by the light from the gap under the door. My vision was still compromised, the halos around the door's edge, the shimmer that the hyperglycemia put into everything, the sense that the world was being viewed through old cellophane. I worked by touch and by the proprioception of hands that knew this motion so deeply it had become something beyond skill. I rolled each strip into a tight, needle-thin cylinder. With the care of a conservator handling archival material, I opened the battery compartment of the glucose meter. The 2 AAA cells came out. I positioned the rolled strips in the narrow gaps between the plastic housing and the internal circuitry. There were 3 gaps, and I used all 3, and replaced the cells. A dead battery went in on top as a decoy. The compartment closed with its habitual click. The meter looked exactly as it had looked before. Exactly as it would look to a woman searching a sick old lady's belongings for evidence of independent thought, like a broken piece of medical equipment. Just like its owner. I pressed my fingertips to the top of the device and held them there for a moment. The weight of what I'd just recorded was enormous. A man's life. An estate. Evidence of conspiracy, extortion, and premeditated murder. All of it compressed into a rolling cylinder of shorthand inside a broken glucose meter in the pocket of a woman who was, according to a signed statement of incapacity, no longer competent to manage her own affairs. The irony was so precise it would have made a good footnote. The door hit the wall with a crack that snapped me fully upright before I'd consciously registered the sound. Robin stood in the frame, backlit by the hallway, the pendant catching the light from behind her. She looked like a silhouette, all shape and no detail, and in the flatness of the image I could see the template she'd been working from all along, the dominant figure in the doorway, the body filling the frame, the entrance designed to establish scale and diminishment. I sat on the edge of the mattress. I let my hands rest loose in my lap. The realtor will be here at 9 a.m., she said. Her honey-brown eyes moved across the room in a slow inventory, the notepad on the nightstand, the glucose meter on the side table, the folded steno paper stack, me. Nothing seemed to alarm her. She saw what she expected to see, a small, gray-haired woman running out of options and blood sugar. You're going to be a very helpful girl. Her eyes completed their circuit and came back to my face. I held her gaze and gave her nothing. Get some sleep, she said. You'll need your strength to sign your life away. She left the door open. Another message. Another reminder that the walls here were hers. I waited until her footsteps had reached the master suite. Then I reached into my cardigan pocket and confirmed, by touch, the presence of the glucose meter. The transcripts were intact. The evidence was present. The trial of Sarah Lane had just acquired its primary exhibit. I closed my eyes and let my spine hold me upright in the dark, and I worked on staying alive until morning. The air in my lungs tasted like fermented fruit. I recognized it, the cloying, internal sweetness of ketoacidosis, the metabolic signature of a body consuming itself for fuel. I had tasted it once before, in 1998, when a miscalculated dose had put me in the ICU for 2 days. I knew the progression the way I knew the structure of an appellate brief: the nausea first, then the headache, then the fraying of the visual field, and finally, if the insulin didn't come, the kidneys would begin their shutdown sequence. I had hours. Perhaps fewer. Downstairs, through the guest room floor, I could hear the muffled register of a male voice I didn't recognize, a baritone, practiced and neutral, the voice of a man who made his living in rooms where other people's property changed hands. The realtor. He had arrived early, or I had lost track of time, which itself was a symptom I filed under deterioration of cognitive function, hyperglycemia-induced. I filed it and moved on. I couldn't wait for a rescue that didn't know I was a prisoner. No one was coming. The neighbors had been preloaded with Robin's narrative. The sheriff was on her payroll. Arthur was in a coma at St. Jude's, and whoever was managing his case had no reason to look for me. The glucose meter was under the mattress, exactly where I'd left it. I reached beneath the frame, my fingers finding the device by touch, and pressed it against my abdomen as I sat up, tucking it into the waistband of my trousers. The transcripts, compressed in their cylinders inside the battery compartment, pressed against my skin. Evidence. My black box. I would not leave the room without it. I stood. The room moved. I held the bedpost until it stopped. I knew this house the way a cartographer knows a finished map. 15 years of living in it had deposited the knowledge into a part of my brain that operated below conscious retrieval, the particular groan of the third floorboard from the guest room door, the way the mudroom latch caught if you didn't apply upward pressure while turning, the 3 inches of clearance between the hall table and the wall that made the difference between a silent passage and a collision. I had never anticipated needing this knowledge for tactical purposes. I used it now without sentimentality. I stepped long over the third floorboard, my hip joint registering its protest in a sharp, grinding pop that I absorbed without expression. I moved through the upstairs corridor with the measured quiet of a woman who had once been the only person in a room full of lawyers whose job was to make noise, and had learned that silence was not the absence of activity but the discipline of it. The mudroom at the back of the ground floor. The smell of damp coats and garden boots hit me as I reached it, rubber and cold soil and the ghost of cut grass, and the familiarity of it was almost unbearable. My coats. My boots. The ones I wore when I gardened on Saturday mornings, the ones with the dried mud on the left sole from the raised bed near the fence. Evidence of a life that was still mine. I pressed the latch. Not turned, pressed, with slow, agonizing downward force, the way I'd learned to open it after the mechanism stiffened in the cold. The door gave without sound, and the evening air came through, and I stepped into it. My knees hit the grass before I'd consciously decided to drop. The strength in my legs had been declining for hours, and the cool air, instead of reviving me, clarified the full extent of the deficit. I went to my knees, then to my stomach, and I began to move across the lawn with my arms, pulling myself through the slick, dew-wet grass the way I had once moved through a crowd, slowly, with intention, conserving what remained for the destination. The silk blouse soaked through immediately. The cold was comprehensive, face, forearms, chest against the sodden ground, and my body had insufficient reserves to generate the heat to counter it. I was aware of this the way I was aware of everything now, clinically, from a slight remove, as if monitoring a situation that required documentation rather than emotion. The fence was perhaps 40 feet. The tree leaned beyond it, the neighbor's property, a working telephone, the ability to form a coherent sentence and be believed. All of it was 40 feet across a lawn that seemed to expand as I moved through it. My vision painted the grass in the shifting, pixelated greens and grays of a system beginning to fail. My heart was doing something wrong, too fast, irregular, a rhythm that had lost its metronome. I pressed on. The first floodlight hit me like a physical impact. High beams, from the service road along the property's east edge. They came on without warning, flooding the lawn with the cold, clinical white of interrogation lighting, and I froze with my cheek against the mud, every instinct simultaneously saying stop and keep moving and producing, in the conflict between them, absolute stillness. The diesel engine was already running. I heard it now, a low vibration through the ground. He'd been parked there, waiting. Either Robin had posted him on rotation, or he'd seen the mudroom light and repositioned. The planning was thorough. I filed that too. A door slammed. The sound of it was heavy and metallic and entirely familiar. I had heard it outside the courthouse for 4 decades, the particular authority of a vehicle built by the lowest acceptable bidder for government contractors. I closed my eyes. I opened them. I remained very still in the mud. Going somewhere, Judith? It's a bit late for a nature hike. The sheriff's voice was thick with the particular cruelty of a man who has been handed his punchlines by someone else and delivers them as his own. Lazy amusement. The pleasure of a man whose power in this specific situation has been so completely guaranteed that mockery costs him nothing. He didn't offer his hand. He reached down and seized my upper arm with the casual force of someone retrieving an object from the floor, his thumb finding a precise point just above the elbow where the skin is thin and the nerve is close to the surface. He yanked me upright without staging. The pain was sharp and immediate, and my legs, expected to support weight without warning, buckled before they caught. I staggered. I found my footing. I did not make a sound. He keyed the shoulder mic without releasing my arm. Robin? Your aunt's wandering again. Found her by the fence. A pause. I'm bringing the poor thing back in. The voice that answered was indistinct. Robin's register, confirmation. He released the mic, and walked me back toward the house with the proprietary grip of a man who had been told the property was already transferred. My free hand moved, briefly, to confirm the glucose meter was still at my waist. Still there. Still intact. I walked. He shoved me through the back door with a single, efficient push between the shoulder blades, and I caught myself on the kitchen island with both hands. The recessed lighting above the island was a physical assault, white and flat and comprehensive, designed to leave nothing in shadow. I blinked against it. The room sorted itself slowly, the granite counter, the steel lockbox on the pantry shelf, the realtor at the kitchen table with his briefcase open, a man in a cheap suit with eyes that registered my entry the way eyes register furniture. He looked down again immediately. Robin stood by the island. The deed of gift was laid out in the center of the counter, a sheaf of papers with tabs indicating signature lines, a fountain pen placed parallel to the top edge with the precision of someone who had done this before. Multiple times. In multiple kitchens. You're making this so much harder than it needs to be, she said. Her honey-brown eyes were different now. The performance had fallen away, the manufactured warmth, the shark smile with its pretense of engagement. What remained was the predator on the final approach, when the gap between hunter and prey has closed to a distance where the mask is no longer worth the energy. She wanted the finish line. She was very close to it. Sit down, she said, and it wasn't a question. I collapsed into the spindle-back chair. The word collapsed is the accurate word. My body, which had been operating for hours on the sheer structural stubbornness of 40 years of discipline, reached the perimeter of what discipline alone could sustain and acknowledged it. I sat in the chair and gripped its edges and felt the room turning on an axis that wasn't there. The faces of Robin and the sheriff moved in my peripheral vision with the slow, nauseating lurch of images seen through warped glass. My breathing had gone shallow, not from emotion, but from the pulmonary effect of blood that had been accumulating ketones for hours, the body compensating for its own acidification with rapid, inefficient breaths that didn't accomplish enough. I was aware of my own heart in my chest with an intimacy that was deeply uncomfortable. It was working too hard. Its rhythm was not clean. I gripped the chair seat. My knuckles went white. Not now. The thought was not a plea, it was an instruction, issued to my own body with the specific firmness I reserved for situations that required a result. Not yet. Stay. Robin came to stand over me. Her shadow fell across my lap, her perfume, thick, floral, aggressively synthetic, pressing against the metallic taste that had settled on the back of my tongue. She reached into the lockbox. The final vial of Humalog. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, 2 inches above the tile floor. The glass caught the recessed lighting and threw a small, cold gleam. The insulin inside was clear, precise, the exact molecular answer to the exact molecular problem occurring inside my body in real time. She held it 2 inches from the floor and looked at me. The sheriff has already drafted the report, she said, and her voice had dropped to the register I recognized from my years in the courts, the register of a closing statement, delivered to a room that has already decided. A tragic suicide. The despair of her diagnosis. A confused woman, alone, unable to cope. She tilted the vial very slightly, a single degree, a demonstration. 1 slip of my fingers, and the medicine is gone. You'll be a memory by sunrise. I looked at the vial. I was not performing the looking. The looking was real. She leaned in. The floral perfume combined with the metallic fear taste in my mouth in a way that was almost chemically unbearable, and I registered the combination and filed it under sensory record, to be provided to investigators upon request. Sign the deed, she said. Sign the transfer of the trust. Do it, and I'll give you the shot. A pause for the grace note. You can live out your days in a nice, quiet facility. They'll keep you comfortable. Or you can die on this kitchen floor, gasping for air, while we watch. She pulled the pen from the counter and held it out, and her honey-brown eyes held the comfortable certainty of a woman who has offered this binary to other women in other rooms and has never received an answer she didn't predict. It's a simple choice, dear. Even you can understand that. I stared at the pen. For 40 years, I had been the room's silent record. The impartial instrument. I had transcribed testimony from men who had murdered whole supply chains, women who had dissolved marriages and families with the surgical application of forged documents, and I had done it with the professional remove of a machine that processes input and produces output and does not editorialize the material between. I had believed, at some level that I'd never fully examined, that the remove was protection. That to be the recorder was to be safe from the recorded. I was the evidence now. I was the thing on trial. The impartial observer was a luxury. She had served her purpose. It was time for the prosecution to take the floor. Please, I rasped. The voice was real, the dryness of it, the rattle underneath the consonants, the breathlessness that punctuated each word. I didn't have to perform the physical reality because the physical reality was performing itself. I let my head drop on its axis, the muscles of my neck releasing with the slow gravity of exhaustion. I can't see the lines. A pause, genuine, because the room had just moved again. I need the shot first. Just a little. To clear the fog. I let the breath come in its shallow, compromised rhythm. Please, Robin. I'll sign whatever you want. The tear was real too. I had not summoned it deliberately, but I did not prevent it. It tracked through the mud that had dried on my left cheek, and I let it go where it went. I needed her to feel the thing she had come here for. The complete collapse of the opponent. The total, unconditional capitulation that meant the game was over and she had won and she could stop being careful, because the careful part was finished. I needed her to step into the room where overconfidence lives, the room just past the finish line, before the work of covering tracks begins. I needed her in the strike zone. She smirked. A short breath, half laugh, the exhale of a woman who has held tension for days and is finally releasing it through the valve of victory. Something loosened in her posture, the coiled spring quality she'd carried since the moment she opened the door to me went slack. She'd won. She knew it. She was letting herself know it. She set the vial on the counter. Within my sight. Out of my reach. The gesture of a woman who no longer needed to hold the leverage over the floor because the leverage had already done its work. The paperwork slid toward me across the granite, the fountain pen following. She pushed both with the proprietary ease of someone organizing a desk that now belonged to her. "Fine," she said. "Sign it first, and I'll give you enough to keep your heart beating." I gripped the pen. My hand trembled. The tremor was genuine, the cumulative physical toll of hours of hyperglycemia, of cold, of the muddy lawn, of the chair and the fear and the fight to stay present in a body that was negotiating its own terms. The nib touched the paper, and the tremor moved through the pen and reached the page, and then it stopped. The way the steno machine stopped trembling the moment my fingers found their position on the keys. The way the hand always steadied itself when the work was real and the record was open. Muscle memory older than the fear. I looked up. Robin's honey-brown eyes were 6 inches from mine, watching the pen, watching the signature she was certain was coming, savoring the last moment before acquisition. She was close enough that I could see the individual strokes of her mascara, the specific texture of the pressed powder on her jaw, the small line of tension at the corner of her mouth that even the shark smile couldn't entirely dissolve. I held her gaze. My steel-blue eyes, which had watched 4 decades of human depravity without flinching, which had watched defense attorneys destroy witnesses and guilty men walk free and the law bent by the weight of money until it almost broke, those eyes found hers and opened fully, and for the first time since she had opened my front door and smiled with her cheekbones, I let her see what was behind them. Not defeat. Not confusion. Not the fog of a diabetic grandmother at the end of her options. Clarity. Absolute, professional, 40-year clarity. The kind that should have terrified her. The nib rested on the paper, and I began to write. My fingers found the paper. Not Judith. Not my name, not my signature, not the legal capitulation that Robin had staged this entire production to obtain. My fingers moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 depositions, the same muscle memory that had steadied the pen 3 seconds ago, that had stopped the tremor the moment the work became real. In the print name, field of the deed of gift, I wrote 11 characters. An alphanumeric string, the Witsec case number from the Valdez cartel trial. A case I had transcribed over 9 months in 1987, a case so sensitive that the stenographer's copy had been sealed under federal order, a case that had generated a protocol I had never expected to use and had never forgotten. Followed by 2 words, spaced, in block capitals, red 0. The emergency code for an active asset seizure. The signal that an asset was in immediate physical danger and requesting a federal breach. The microtransmitter in Arthur's gold pendant, pressed against Robin's throat for the past 24 hours, broadcasting on a frequency monitored by the Marshal Service Division that had managed the Valdez case for 2 decades, had been transmitting everything. Her phone calls. Her routing numbers. Her plan for Arthur's DNR. Her plan for my stairs. They had been listening. They had been waiting for the code that told them I was ready. I set the pen down. It clicked against the granite with a sound like a pistol being cocked. I leaned back in the spindleback chair and looked at Robin. Not at her chin, not at the pendant, not at the insulin vial on the counter. At her eyes. Direct. Unblinking. The gaze I had trained on defense attorneys who were lying and witnesses who were about to break and judges who needed to feel the weight of the record I was keeping. "There's a detail you missed in your narrative," I said. My voice was quiet. Not weak, quiet, the way a sentence delivered at the end of a closing argument is quiet, because the room is already listening. Sarah. Her real name. The name on the federal warrant. The name she had not heard spoken aloud in this house, in this county, possibly in years. The honey brown of her eyes changed. Something moved behind them, not quite recognition, not quite fear, something anterior to both, the split-second neurological event of a person who has just received information that does not fit the model they have been operating from. The model where I was confused. Frail. Already finished. Arthur didn't just have a stroke, I said. He woke up for 10 minutes yesterday morning. Before you arrived. He confirmed everything. I held her gaze. The marshals had been waiting for me to give them the word. The kitchen went absolutely quiet. Not the quiet of an empty room, the pressurized quiet of a room in which every person present has just recalculated their positions simultaneously. The realtor looked up from his briefcase for the first time since I'd been shoved through the back door. The sheriff's hand stopped moving on his belt. Robin's arm, extended toward the counter, fingers hovering above the insulin vial, became perfectly still, suspended over the tile, frozen in the posture of a predator whose prey has just revealed itself to be something else entirely. She looked at the paper. At the characters in the print name field. At the code that was not her deed and was not my surrender. Her face went the color of curdled milk, the specific, bloodless pallor of a woman who has just understood the full geometry of what she's built, and seen for the first time how thoroughly it can be turned against her. Every phone call she'd made with the pendant at her throat. Every routing number she'd recited. Every plan she'd narrated with the casual confidence of someone who believed the only witness in the room was already neutralized. She hadn't neutralized me. She had recorded herself. Into my archive. You bitch, she hissed. The predatory mask, the shark smile, the melodic voice, the manufactured warmth, was gone, dissolved in the acid of real panic, and what was underneath was something rawer and less controlled, the snarl of a woman who has never, in all her professional years, encountered a situation she couldn't exit. Her fingers twitched toward my throat. The clock ran out. The world became white. The kitchen windows didn't break. Broke is the wrong word. Breaks involve process, involve the incremental failure of structure. The windows vaporized. One instant glass, the next instant a spectacular, horizontal spray of fragments and displaced air and the concussive force of flashbang detonations that arrived simultaneously at every exterior frame, the sound of physical blow that compressed the air in my chest and flattened my lungs. I had squeezed my eyes shut a half-second before impact, not from premonition, but from the specific, reflexive preparation of a woman who had spent her career anticipating the moment a preceding changes register. The white light hit my eyelids and turned the inside of my vision red. I counted. 1,000. 2 1,000. Through the ringing, a single, sustained tone that sat at the frequency of a tuning fork struck against granite, I heard them. The rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots on hardwood. Multiple entry points, coordinated, the percussion of a team that has rehearsed this specific floor plan. The crash of the back door. The shattering of the mudroom frame. The front door going in with a sound like a thunderclap. The record was no longer silent. Police. Federal marshals. Hands in the air. The kitchen filled in seconds. Black-clad, helmeted, moving with the organized efficiency of people who have converted their training into reflex. Red laser dots swept the walls, the ceiling, the faces of the people in the room, dancing with the clinical precision of a system performing threat assessment. The sheriff reached for his belt. It was a reflex, I could see it, the involuntary grab of a man who had spent 30 years as the most powerful person in any room he entered, whose hand had learned the motion before his brain could override it. A marshal came out of the left entrance with a tackle that was so clean and heavy it was almost geometric, a textbook application of mass and momentum. The sheriff went down. His glasses left his face and skittered across my tile. Robin was shoved against the kitchen island with a force that pressed her face into the paperwork, her deed, her transfer documents, the legal architecture of a seizure she had spent months constructing, and held her there with an arm across her shoulders and a knee in the small of her back. The silk robe that had belonged to my brother's late wife bunched around her, and her dark mahogany ponytail came loose against the granite. The realtor put his hands up without being told. A man who made his living understanding when a deal was over. A hand came to my shoulder. Not the bruising seizure of the sheriff, not Robin's proprietary grip. A steady, level pressure, the specific touch of someone trained to make contact with a person in crisis without adding to the crisis. I turned my head. A tactical medic, a young man whose face I would remember later as calm and unremarkable in the way that competence at crisis is always unremarkable, was already working. "Stay with me, Judith," he said. Not a question. An instruction delivered as a courtesy. He didn't ask me to hold still. He located the vein in my forearm with 2 fingers and worked without ceremony. The needle was precise. The cool, controlled flow of an insulin drip entered my bloodstream, and I felt it the way you feel the first breath after surfacing from deep water, not immediate, not total, but the beginning of a process that was moving in the right direction. The sweetness at the back of my throat, the ketoacidotic signature I'd been breathing for hours, began to recede. In its place, rubbing alcohol, clean and sharp. The smell of a medical situation being managed. The smell of a crisis acquiring competent personnel. I let my eyes close for exactly 3 seconds. Then I opened them. I had work to finish. I raised my hand. The 4-line tracked with it, the bag swaying on the medic's portable stand. I pointed toward the counter where my glucose meter lay beside the overturned lockbox. The lead marshal, a man with a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than standard issue material, all flat planes and considered economy of expression, picked up the device. He looked at me. I made a twisting motion with my hand, the gesture of opening a compartment, and he understood. He found the seam, applied pressure, and the battery cover released. Instead of AAA cells, a cascade of paper ribbons spilled onto the granite counter. Thin, white, tightly rolled, the edges of each strip precise and clean. They came out in sequence, unfurling slightly in the recessed kitchen air, a physical archive spreading itself across the counter like evidence in a proceeding that had just moved from the covert to the formal. The marshal picked up the nearest strip and unrolled it. He held it under the overhead light and read. His eyes moved quickly. He had seen shorthand before, or he had been briefed that he might encounter it. His face didn't change, but his posture did, a barely perceptible shift in the angle of his shoulders that I recognized as the physical response to confirmation. Routing numbers for the Caymans. He moved to the next strip. Transcripts of the realtor's solicitation. Another strip. His voice remained level, the voice of a man building a record. Threat of medical homicide. Conspiracy to commit murder, 1st degree. He set the strip down and looked across the room at Robin, who was being pulled upright from the counter, her silk robe torn along the shoulder seam, a smear of her own foundation makeup across the deed she'd never get signed. "Sarah Lane," he said. "You have the right to remain silent." I watched her face as he read her the Miranda. For a woman who had operated entirely through the manipulation of language, the melodic voice, the calibrated warmth, the manufactured narratives delivered to sheriffs and neighbors and pharmacists and probably a dozen other elderly women in a dozen other houses, the right to remain silent was the most precise justice I had ever witnessed administered. I had produced thousands of transcripts in 40 years. This was the most satisfying. They moved her toward the door. She turned in the grip of the marshal escorting her. The mask had been gone since the flashbangs. What was left on her face now was something I recognized from the Valdez trial, from the testimony of men who had finally been cornered after years of operating without consequence. Not remorse. Not guilt. Rage, the specific, disbelieving rage of a predator who has been caught, who cannot comprehend the mechanism of the catch, who needs someone to blame for the impossibility of what has just occurred. "You were supposed to be nobody," she screamed. Her voice cracked on the last word, the melodic register destroyed, the real voice underneath it stripped bare, younger sounding than I expected, rawer, the voice of a woman from somewhere difficult who had learned, very early, that the world responded better to a performance than to whatever was underneath. "You were supposed to be a stupid, sick, old." In 40 years of court reporting, I said, I learned one thing. My voice was quiet. The room heard it anyway, the room was trained to hear the quiet ones. The marshals heard it. The medic heard it. Even the realtor, being walked out in zip ties, turned his head. "There are no invisible people," I said. "There are only people like you, who are too arrogant to pay attention." I held her gaze for one more second. The same unblinking, recording gaze. The same steel-blue eyes that had watched the Valdez cartel testify and watched defense attorneys lie and watched guilty men walk and had kept the record of all of it with absolute, unimpeachable accuracy. Then I looked away from her. Deliberately. "The way you close a file." "Take her out of my house," I said to the marshal. He did. The house cleared. The process was gradual, the marshals working through each room, securing the perimeter, logging evidence, the sheriff's cruiser backing out of my circular driveway with a different driver at the wheel. The realtor's briefcase went into an evidence bag. The signed statement of incapacity, the sheriff's signature across the bottom, the one he'd scrawled while Robin held my hand against the water glass, went into a separate bag with its own label. The sirens diminished. The radio chatter faded. The last vehicle pulled out, and the house absorbed the quiet the way it always had, the way old houses do, the way this house specifically did, with the ticking of the grandfather clock and the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the Pacific Northwest dark settling back into its natural arrangement around the tree-line. I sat at the kitchen island. The 4-bag hung from its portable stand beside me, nearly empty, the drip having done most of its work. The medic had given me water, a full glass, cold, the first clean drink I'd had since yesterday morning, and I held it in both hands and took a slow sip and felt the reality of it. The temperature. The weight. The clean, specific taste of water that is just water, with nothing mixed into it, no sweetness of ketones, no metallic edge of fear. Through the kitchen window, the sky above the tree-line was beginning to change. Not sunrise yet, the suggestion of it, the first bleed of gray at the horizon that precedes the color. The Douglas firs stood in their dark row, unchanged. The lawn I had dragged myself across was damp and rutted from boots, the grass pressed flat in the pattern of the breech team's approach route. My house. My window. My lawn, even torn up. My sky. I was not a piece of evidence anymore. I was not a narrative, not a tragic diagnosis, not a confused and forgettable old woman with failing blood sugar and no phone. I was the person who had been in the room and heard everything and written it down. I was the survivor. I took another sip of water and let the grandfather clock mark the time. 2 days later, I sat in a chair beside Arthur's hospital bed at St. Jude's. The room was quiet in the specific way that ICU rooms are quiet, monitored, managed, the silence of a place where the equipment does the speaking. The machines tracked his vitals with soft, rhythmic precision. His face, against the pillow, had the particular slack relaxation of deep sedation, but the color had come back to his skin, and the doctors, cautious, as good doctors are, hedging appropriately, had used the word optimistic twice in 48 hours, which in medical language is the equivalent of a firm handshake and a nod. I opened my leather-bound steno pad to a fresh page. The fountain pen, my preferred instrument, retrieved from my study once the marshals had cleared the house, refilled with Prussian blue ink from the bottle in my desk drawer where I'd kept it for 11 years, felt correct in my hand in a way that the borrowed ballpoint never had. Familiar. Calibrated to my grip. An old colleague. I wrote. Names of the arresting officers, rendered in full and in proper sequence. The docket number assigned to United States vs. Lane. The specific time of the breach, 4:47 a.m., confirmed against the kitchen clock when the medic had noted it in his incident log. The charges as read. The evidence logged. The status of each party at the time of my last direct observation. I owed Arthur the truth, rendered in the system I had used for 40 years, the system that produced records that could not be disputed, that had no gaps, that did not editorialize or omit. He would wake up to a world that still belonged to him because I had kept it for him while he was gone. This was the record of how it had been kept. I wrote until the page was full. Then I turned to the next page and continued. Outside the ICU window, the morning was clear. A specific, high-pressure Pacific Northwest clear that arrived after storms, when the atmosphere had been wrung clean and the light had no humidity to diffuse it. It came through the window in a precise, angled column and fell across the steno pad, and I worked in it, my hand moving at the pace the content required, steady and without hurry. I wrote until I had recorded everything. Back home, I walked directly to my study. The steno machine had been returned by the marshals from the garage. It sat on the mahogany desk where it belonged, the keyboard aligned with the edge of the blotter with the precision of something restored to a position it had occupied for 15 years. Someone on the breach team had noticed it in the garage and understood that it belonged somewhere specific. I appreciated the competence. I noted it. I went to the filing cabinet. Third drawer. Hanging files, alphabetically organized, spines labeled in my own hand in the black felt tip I used specifically for archive labeling, a different pen for a different purpose, the same discipline applied to every system. I found the folder immediately. I always did. S. Lane/alias Robin. I laid it on the desk. I opened it. Inside, the original notes from my surveillance transcripts, now duplicated in the Federal Evidence Archive, but the original's mine, produced by my hand, the first record of the case. I looked at the name on the tab for a moment. Sarah Lane had come into my house with a plan that was, by any professional assessment, thorough. She had researched the conservatorship law. She had cultivated the sheriff over time. She had prepared the documentation, the narrative, the medical leverage. She had understood that the most vulnerable point was the insulin, and she had moved on it immediately. She was, in the taxonomy of grifters, skilled. She had made one mistake. She had looked at a 65-year-old retired stenographer and seen the end of a story, when she was in fact looking at a woman who had spent 40 years learning exactly how stories end. I picked up the ruler. Red ink. A single stroke, heavy and clean, drawn from the top left of her name to the bottom right. One line. The way you mark a transcript section that has been fully reviewed, fully processed, officially complete. Case adjudicated. Record closed. I closed the folder. I filed it. I pushed the drawer shut with the soft, definitive click of a well-maintained cabinet. I walked to the kitchen and filled the kettle. Earl Grey, the good kind, loose leaf, measured with the small silver scoop I'd had for 20 years, brewed at exactly 200 degrees for 4 minutes because that was the temperature and time that produced the result I wanted, and I saw no reason to compromise on a thing I'd gotten right. I set the cup on the counter by the window that now had a sheet of plywood where the glass had been, courtesy of the marshal's breach team, until the glazier could come Thursday. I stood at my counter, in my kitchen, and waited for the kettle to speak. The grandfather clock ticked in the hallway. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the tree line, a bird had decided that the morning was established enough to comment on. I picked up the cup. I held it in both hands, the warmth moving through the ceramic into my palms, into the calluses on the pads of my fingers where 40 years of steno keys had left their permanent record on my skin. The silence of my home settled around me like a finished transcript. Complete. Accurate. Admissible. I had been the only one in the room who heard everything. For the record, that was always enough. If you made it to this moment, thank you for listening all the way through. Most people bail before the bill comes due. But here, the bill always comes due. What started as humiliation and disrespect ended with receipts, truth, and a payoff they never saw coming. If you want more stories where karma shows up without mercy, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what was the most disgusting thing they did? What crossed the line for you?